The last laugh. Margaret Chen had always believed that family meant something. At 72, with silver hair that caught the morning light streaming through her kitchen window, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to measure her steps, not from frailty, but from wisdom earned through decades of small disappointments and smaller victories. The lottery tickets sat on the kitchen counter like two white promises, their surfaces scratched silver, revealing numbers that meant nothing to her. She'd bought them on a whim yesterday, something she'd never done before. Brenda, her daughter-in-law of 8 years, had laughed when she suggested it. "Come on, Ma Chen," Brenda had said, using the nickname that had once felt affectionate, but now carried an edge Margaret couldn't quite name. "Let's be lottery partners. 50-50 on everything, right? Like we always are." Margaret remembered the way Brenda's eyes had sparkled with mischief, how she'd grabbed Margaret's weathered hands with her manicured ones. At 35, Brenda still moved through the world with the confidence of someone who believed good things happened to people like her. Margaret had envied that confidence once. Now it made her tired. "You scratch yours, I'll scratch mine. Whoever wins buys dinner at that fancy place downtown you're always talking about." They laughed together then, two women sharing what felt like a harmless joke. Margaret's ticket was a dud, 3 mismatched numbers that added up to nothing. She'd crumpled it and tossed it toward the trash can, missing by inches. Her aim wasn't what it used to be. But Brenda's ticket... Margaret's hands trembled now as she held the local newspaper, the headlines swimming before her eyes. "Local woman wins $90 million jackpot." Below it, a photograph of Brenda standing in front of the convenience store where they'd bought their tickets, arms raised in victory, smile blazing like a searchlight. The article quoted her extensively. "I've been playing the same numbers for years. They're my late mother's birthday and anniversary dates. I always knew they'd come through for me eventually." Margaret read the words 3 times before their meaning penetrated fully. Late mother's birthday. Anniversary dates. Numbers they'd chosen together just 24 hours ago, Brenda closing her eyes and pointing randomly at the selection card while Margaret watched and laughed. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and Brenda's voice carried through the house like music played too loud. "Ma Chen, you'll never believe what happened." Margaret set down the newspaper carefully, as if it were made of glass. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see Brenda in the foyer, designer handbag slung over her shoulder, face flushed with excitement. She wore new clothes, a cream-colored blazer Margaret had never seen before, tailored perfectly to her figure. "I saw the paper," Margaret said quietly. Brenda's smile faltered for just a moment, then blazed brighter. "Isn't it incredible? $90 million. Can you even imagine? I still can't believe it's real." She moved into the kitchen with the fluid grace of someone riding a wave of pure joy, and Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was her kitchen, where she'd made breakfast for her son David every morning for the first 10 years of his marriage to Brenda, where she'd taught her granddaughter Emma to make dumplings before Brenda decided the mess wasn't worth it. "We need to talk about what happens next," Brenda continued, settling into the chair across from Margaret with the ease of ownership. "I've already been to the lottery office this morning, had to get there early to avoid the crowds, and I've got appointments with financial advisors this afternoon." Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. "We?" Something flickered across Brenda's features, quick as a shadow passing over sunlight. "Well, you know what I mean. This is going to change everything for our family. David and Emma, they're going to have opportunities they never dreamed of. College funds, travel, a real future." "What about our agreement?" The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Brenda's laugh came too quickly, too bright. "Agreement? Ma Chen, we were just joking around. You know that, right? Your ticket didn't win anything." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, the way it had when the doctor had told her about Robert's heart attack 3 years ago. The same sensation of reality shifting beneath her feet, leaving her grasping for something solid to hold on to. "But we said 50-50 on everything. Come on." Brenda's voice carried a note of impatience now, barely concealed beneath its forced cheerfulness. We were having fun. Nobody makes those kinds of deals seriously. Besides, these are my numbers. I've been thinking about playing them for months. Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law's face, searching for some recognition of the woman who had laughed with her yesterday, who had grabbed her hands and called her partner. But Brenda's expression had shifted into something Margaret didn't recognize, still smiling, but with the hardness of someone who had already decided what truth looked like. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Brenda continued, her tone taking on the patient cadence of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "This is my ticket, one with my numbers. I'm grateful you were there to share the moment with me, but let's not get confused about what actually happened." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of 72 years pressing down on her shoulders. How many times had she swallowed words like these? How many small betrayals had she absorbed in the name of keeping peace? "I see," she said finally. Brenda's relief was visible, her shoulders dropping as if she'd been prepared for a fight. "I knew you'd understand. You're so reasonable, Ma Chen. That's what I've always loved about you." The endearment felt like a slap now. Margaret nodded slowly, watching as Brenda pulled out her phone and began scrolling through messages, already moving on to more important things. "Actually," Brenda said without looking up, "we should probably talk about living arrangements." Margaret's blood cold. "Living arrangements? Well, with all this money, David and I are going to want to start fresh. New house, new neighborhood, somewhere that reflects our new circumstances. I've already been looking at some properties in Westbrook Hills. You should see them. They're incredible." Margaret gripped the edge of the kitchen table. "This is my house, Brenda. Technically, it's in David's name. Has been since Dad passed." Brenda looked up from her phone with what might have been sympathy if Margaret hadn't known better. "Look, I'm not heartless. I know this is hard, but we need space for our new life. And honestly, maintaining a house this size is getting to be too much for someone your age anyway." The casual cruelty of it took Margaret's breath away. Someone your age. As if being 72 meant she'd forfeited her right to the home where she'd raised her son, where she'd cared for her dying husband, where every room held memories that belonged to her alone. "Where am I supposed to go?" Brenda's smile was bright and empty. "There are some lovely senior communities around here, much more appropriate for someone in your situation. Less maintenance, activities with people your own age. You might actually prefer it." Margaret felt something breaking inside her chest, something that had been bent and strained for years, finally snapping under the weight of this moment. But instead of collapsing, she felt herself growing straighter, as if the breaking had freed something that had been trapped. "I see," she said again, but this time the words carried a different weight. Brenda was back to her phone, thumb swiping through real estate listings with the focused intensity of someone planning a future that had no room for inconvenient truths. "I'm thinking we should start looking at places next week. Strike while the iron's hot. I'll even help you pack." Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement. "That's very kind of you." Something in her tone must have registered because Brenda glanced up. But whatever she saw in Margaret's face didn't seem to concern her. She'd already won, after all. The lottery ticket was in her name, the house was in her husband's name, and Margaret was just an old woman who could be managed with the right combination of patience and firmness. "I should let you get back to your planning," Margaret said, moving toward the kitchen doorway. "Thanks for being so understanding about all this. I know it's a big change, but it's going to be good for everyone. You'll see." Margaret climbed the stairs to her bedroom, each step echoing in the house that had been her sanctuary for 35 years. In her room, she closed the door and sat heavily on the bed where she'd slept beside Robert for 43 years, where she'd held her son as a baby, where she'd cried alone after the funeral. The house was quiet around her, but she could hear Brenda's voice drifting up from the kitchen, bright and animated as she spoke on the phone to someone about property values and square footage. Planning the future with Margaret's lottery ticket and Margaret's house and Margaret's son, who would undoubtedly go along with whatever Brenda decided because he always did. Margaret opened the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was her marriage certificate, birth certificates for herself and David, and the deed to the house. The original deed, from before David's name had been added. She unfolded the deed carefully, running her fingers over the familiar legal language. The house had been hers and Robert's, purchased with money they'd saved for 15 years, every payment a small victory against an uncertain world. When David had married Brenda, Robert had suggested adding David's name to make inheritance easier. It had seemed like a practical decision at the time. Now Margaret wondered if practical decisions were just another name for giving up pieces of yourself till there was nothing left. She thought about yesterday, about the moment when Brenda had suggested buying lottery tickets, the way she'd laughed and grabbed Margaret's hands, the warmth in her eyes as she talked about being partners. Had that been calculated? Had Brenda somehow known? Or was she simply the kind of person who took whatever she could get and justified it afterward? Margaret supposed it didn't matter. The result was the same. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and she answered on the third ring. "Mom, I just heard. Brenda called and told me about the lottery. Isn't it incredible?" Margaret closed her eyes, hearing the excitement in her son's voice. "Yes, incredible. $90 million. I can't even wrap my head around it. Brenda says you were with her when she bought the ticket. You must have felt like such a good luck charm." A good luck charm. Margaret almost laughed at the bitter irony of it. Something like that.
Listen, she mentioned you guys talked about living arrangements. I know it might seem sudden, but she's got a point about starting fresh. And some of those senior communities are really nice. Mrs. Patterson from down the street moved into one last year, and she loves it. Margaret opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling where a water stain from last winter's storm still marked the plaster like a bruise. "Is that what you want, David?" "I want what's best for everyone. And honestly, Mom, you've been carrying the burden of this house for too long. Maybe it's time to let someone else worry about the maintenance and the expenses." The burden. Her home had become a burden. Margaret felt that broken thing in her chest shift again, settling into a new configuration that felt sharper, more focused. "I should let you go," she said. "I'm sure you have a lot to discuss with Brenda. We'll figure everything out, Mom, don't worry. This is going to be great for all of us." After he hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her room, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 7 decades. Outside, she could hear Brenda's car starting, probably heading out to look at properties in Westbrook Falls. Margaret walked to her window and watched the silver sedan pull out of the driveway. When it disappeared around the corner, she went back downstairs to the kitchen, where the crumpled lottery ticket still lay on the floor beside the trash can. She picked it up and smoothed it out on the counter, studying the numbers that had meant nothing yesterday and everything today. Then she walked to the living room where Robert's old desk sat in the corner, still organized exactly as he'd left it. In the bottom drawer, beneath manila folders full of insurance papers and old tax returns, she found what she was looking for: a small digital camera Robert had bought years ago to document his garden. Margaret had never used it, but she'd watched him enough times to understand the basic functions. She took the camera back to the kitchen and photographed the crumpled lottery ticket, making sure the numbers were clearly visible. Then she photographed the newspaper article, focusing on Brenda's quotes about her late mother's birthday and anniversary dates. When she was finished, she sat at the kitchen table, where she'd shared 1,000 meals with her family, where she'd helped Emma with homework, where just yesterday she'd laughed with a woman she'd thought she knew. Margaret had never been one for grand gestures or dramatic confrontations.
She'd spent her life smoothing rough edges, keeping peace, making room for other people's needs and wants and dreams. But sitting in her kitchen with the evidence of betrayal spread before her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The fierce, clarifying burn of righteous anger. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Tom Walsh, the lawyer who had handled Robert's estate. They'd been friends for 40 years, ever since he'd been a young attorney helping them buy their first house. Tom, it's Margaret Chen. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I have a legal question. His voice was warm with familiarity. Margaret, not at all. What can I help you with? I need to understand something about verbal agreements. If two people agree to split something 50-50 and there are witnesses, does that have any legal weight? There was a pause. That depends on several factors. Can you give me more context? Margaret found herself telling him everything. The lottery tickets, the agreement, Brenda's claims about her numbers, the newspaper article, and the demand that she leave her home. Tom listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions. Do you have any proof of the original agreement? He asked when she finished. Not directly, but I have the newspaper clipping where she claims these were numbers she'd been thinking about for months, and I have my losing ticket that shows we bought them together. I also have something else. Margaret walked to the kitchen counter where she'd left her phone after taking the pictures. Tom, what if I told you that the numbers Brenda claimed belonged to her late mother weren't randomly chosen yesterday? What if I could prove she lied about that? What do you mean? Margaret smiled for the first time all day, and it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Brenda's mother isn't dead, Tom. She lives in Phoenix. I have her phone number in my address book. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Then Tom's voice came back, carefully controlled. Margaret, are you absolutely certain about that? I sent her a Christmas card last year. Brenda calls her every Sunday. Margaret felt the sharp satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place. She told the newspaper these were her late mother's birthday and anniversary dates, but her mother is very much alive, and more importantly, those aren't even the right dates. How do you know the dates? Because Brenda threw her mother a surprise party for her 70th birthday 2 months ago. I helped plan it. Margaret pulled out her calendar and flipped back to July. Her birthday is July 15th. Her anniversary with Brenda's father was October 3rd. The numbers on our lottery ticket were 12, 28, 6, 15, 31, and 42. None of those correspond to the dates she claimed. Tom was quiet again, and Margaret could almost hear his legal mind working through the implications. Margaret, I think we need to meet. Are you free this afternoon? I have nowhere else to be. I'll be right over. Don't talk to anyone about this until we've had a chance to discuss your options. After she hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. The intoxicating sensation of holding all the cards. Brenda had been so confident, so certain that Margaret would simply accept whatever story she told. It had never occurred to her that the old woman might fight back. Margaret walked through her house, seeing it with new eyes. Each room held memories that belonged to her, stories that had shaped her life. The living room where David had taken his first steps, the kitchen where Robert had proposed to her 45 years ago, the back porch where they'd sat together every evening watching the seasons change. This was her home. These were her memories, and no one, not even family, had the right to take them away based on lies and manipulation. When Tom arrived an hour later, he carried a briefcase and wore the expression of a man who had been practicing law long enough to have seen every variation of human greed and deception. Margaret, I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe you may have several legal options. But first, I need you to understand something. If we pursue this, it's going to get ugly. Family disputes over money always do. Margaret nodded. I understand. Your daughter-in-law has already publicly claimed those numbers as her own based on what appears to be a deliberate lie about their origin. She's also demanding you leave your home, presumably so she and her son can benefit from your displacement. Is that accurate? Yes. Tom opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. Let's start with the verbal contract. In Michigan, verbal contracts can be enforceable under certain circumstances. The fact that you both purchased tickets with the understanding that you'd split any winnings 50-50 could constitute a valid agreement, especially if we can establish a pattern of such agreements or find witnesses. Emma was there when we talked about it. My granddaughter. She heard Brenda say we were partners. How old is Emma? 15. Old enough to testify if necessary. Tom made a note. Good. Now, about the fraudulent claims to the press, that's potentially more serious. If she knowingly made false statements about the origin of those numbers, especially if she continues to benefit from those lies, it could constitute fraud. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. What does that mean? It means we might be able to challenge her claim to the entire jackpot. At minimum, we can demand an accounting and potentially force a division of the winnings. Tom looked up from his notes. But, Margaret, I have to ask, are you prepared for the possibility that this could destroy your relationship with your son and granddaughter? Family lawsuits have a way of creating permanent damage. Margaret thought about David's voice on the phone, so excited about money that wasn't his, so quick to agree that she should be displaced from her own home. She thought about Emma, who hadn't called or visited in weeks, too busy with her teenage life to spare time for her grandmother.
They've already made their choice, she said quietly. I'm just deciding whether to accept it. Tom studied her face for a long moment. All right then, let's talk strategy. For the next 2 hours, they planned Margaret's counterattack. Tom would file an injunction to prevent Brenda from collecting the full jackpot until the dispute could be resolved. He would depose Emma about the conversation she'd witnessed. Most importantly, he would contact Brenda's very much alive mother in Phoenix and ask her about the lottery numbers and dates that had supposedly held such sentimental meaning. One more thing, Tom said, as he prepared to leave. Document everything from now on. Every conversation, every interaction. If Brenda or David contact you about moving out or signing any papers, record it if possible. This case is going to come down to credibility, and we need to make sure yours is unshakable. Margaret walked him to the door, feeling lighter than she had in months. As his car pulled away, she noticed Brenda's silver sedan turning into the driveway. Perfect timing. Brenda entered the house with the energy of someone who had spent the day making exciting plans. She carried shopping bags from expensive stores and wore a new watch that caught the afternoon light. Ma Chen, you should have seen the houses I looked at today. There's one that's absolutely perfect. 6 bedrooms, 4 baths, a swimming pool, and a view of the lake. David is going to love it. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law arrange her shopping bags on the sofa as if she were already the lady of the manor. It sounds lovely. I put a hold on it, just in case. The realtor says in this market, you have to move fast. And look what I picked up for you. Information about that senior community I mentioned, Sunset Manor. They have activities every day and a shuttle service for shopping. Margaret accepted the brochure with a smile that felt like putting on a mask. How thoughtful. I was thinking we could drive over there tomorrow and take a tour. Get the ball rolling, you know. I'd hate for you to end up on a waiting list. Actually, Margaret said, settling into her favorite chair, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I realized I should probably talk to a lawyer before I make any major decisions. Something flickered across Brenda's face. Surprise maybe, or annoyance quickly suppressed. A lawyer? Ma Chen, why would you need a lawyer? Well, there's the matter of the house, of course, making sure everything is handled properly, and then there's the question of the lottery ticket. Brenda's laugh sounded forced. We already discussed that. There's nothing to discuss. Margaret nodded slowly.
I know that's what you said. But I got to thinking about those numbers you told the newspaper about, your late mother's birthday and anniversary. What about them? I was just wondering why you never mentioned your mother had passed away. We've been family for 8 years, and I've been sending her Christmas cards all this time. When did she die? The color drained from Brenda's face so quickly that Margaret almost felt sorry for her. Almost. What are you talking about? The newspaper article? You said those were your late mother's birthday and anniversary dates. But your mother called last week to ask about Emma's school schedule. I spoke to her myself. Brenda opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Margaret had never seen her at a loss for words before. It was fascinating, like watching someone's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding, Brenda said finally. The reporter must have gotten confused. About your mother being dead? I never said she was dead. I said those were meaningful numbers. The reporter just assumed. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened the news article she'd saved. Would you like me to read it to you? They're my late mother's birthday and anniversary dates. I always knew they'd come through for me eventually. Brenda's composure cracked completely. Look, what difference does it make? The ticket is mine. I bought it. It's in my name. End of story. But we agreed to split everything 50-50. Emma heard us. Emma's a kid. She doesn't understand adult conversations. Adult conversations. Is that what you call lying to the press and trying to steal an old woman's home? Brenda's mask slipped entirely, revealing something ugly underneath. Steal? This is my house now, Margaret. Mine and David's. And that lottery ticket is mine too. You want to know the truth? I've been waiting 8 years for you to get out of our lives. This jackpot is just the excuse I needed.
The honesty was almost refreshing. Margaret had suspected as much, but hearing it stated so baldly confirmed everything she'd wondered about over the years. All those times Brenda had been just a little too quick to dismiss her opinions, just a little too eager to make decisions that excluded her. I see, Margaret said. Well, at least we're being honest now. You don't have a choice, Brenda continued, apparently deciding that pretense was no longer necessary. You're an old woman with no money and no options. I have $90 million and a husband who agrees with everything I want. So you can make this easy on yourself or you can make it hard. But either way, you're going to end up in some senior home counting your Social Security checks. Margaret stood slowly, feeling every one of her 72 years, but also feeling the weight of 7 decades of experience and wisdom. You know what, Brenda? You're absolutely right about one thing. What's that? I am an old woman, but you made one mistake in your calculations. Brenda's eyes narrowed. What mistake? Margaret smiled, and this time it was genuine. You assumed that being old meant being helpless, but I've been fighting battles longer than you've been alive, and I've learned something you haven't figured out yet. Which is? The truth always wins in the end. It might take time, it might be messy, but lies have a way of collapsing under their own weight. Margaret walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the phone number for Tom Walsh. I called my lawyer this afternoon. We're going to court. For a moment, Brenda looked genuinely shocked. Then her expression hardened into something that looked almost admiring. You sneaky old bitch. Margaret laughed, surprised by the sound of her own amusement. I suppose I am. But I'm a sneaky old bitch who knows the difference between your mother's real birthday and the random numbers we picked yesterday. Brenda's face went white again. What are you talking about? July 15th. That's your mother's real birthday. I helped plan her surprise party, remember? The lottery numbers don't match any of the dates you claimed. Your whole story is a lie, and I can prove it. The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Margaret could see Brenda's mind working, calculating, trying to find an angle that would salvage her position. But there wasn't one, and they both knew it. Fine, she said finally. We'll see what a judge says about verbal agreements between family members.
Good luck proving anything. After Brenda left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, Margaret sat in her kitchen and called Emma. "Grandma? Hi, I was just thinking about you." The warmth in her granddaughter's voice brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "Hello, sweetheart. Are you busy? Just homework. What's up?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I need to ask you about yesterday, when your mother and I bought those lottery tickets. Do you remember the conversation we had?" There was a pause. "You mean about being partners?" "Yeah, Mom was really excited about it. She kept saying you guys were going to split everything 50-50 like real business partners. Do you remember her exact words?"
Let me think. She said something like, "Whatever happens, we're in this together, right, Ma Chen? 50-50 on everything, just like always." And then you guys laughed and shook hands. It was cute. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "Emma, I need to tell you something, and it might be difficult to hear." For the next 20 minutes, Margaret explained the situation as gently as she could. She talked about the lottery win, about Brenda's claims to the press, about the plan to remove Margaret from her home. Emma listened in stunned silence. "That doesn't make sense," Emma said finally. "Why would Mom lie about something like that?" "Sometimes people change when money is involved, sweetheart. Sometimes they become someone we don't recognize." Emma was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Then, "Grandma, are you really going to sue Mom?" "I'm going to fight for what's right, for the truth." "But what about the family? What about Dad and me?" Margaret's heart broke a little at the fear in her granddaughter's voice. "The family broke first, Emma. I'm just deciding whether to pretend it didn't happen." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, surrounded by the silence of her empty house. Tomorrow, the legal battle would begin in earnest. Tom would file the papers, contact the Lottery Commission, start the process that would determine whether truth mattered more than possession. But tonight, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The quiet satisfaction of knowing she was fighting for something worth fighting for. Not just money, though the lottery winnings would certainly change her life. Not just the house, though this place held everything that mattered to her. She was fighting for the principle that trust meant something, that promises had weight, that an old woman's dignity was worth defending even when it was inconvenient for other people. Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, planning her next moves with the strategic mind of someone who had been underestimated for the last time. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in Tom Walsh's office, reviewing the deposition transcripts that would change everything. Emma had been a reluctant but honest witness, confirming every detail of the conversation she'd overheard. More importantly, Brenda's mother in Phoenix had been bewildered and then furious to learn that her daughter had claimed she was dead. She told reporters, "What? Those numbers don't mean anything to our family. My birthday is July 15th, not whatever date that lottery ticket has. And my anniversary with Brenda's father was October 3rd, not any of those other numbers. I can send you copies of my birth certificate and marriage license if you need proof." The Lottery Commission had frozen the jackpot pending the legal investigation. Brenda had hired her own lawyer, but her story kept changing. First, she claimed the numbers had special meaning. Then she said she'd been misquoted by the newspaper. Finally, she fell back on the argument that verbal agreements weren't legally binding. But Tom had done his homework. He'd found precedents for enforcing verbal contracts, especially when supported by witness testimony and evidence of fraudulent claims. More damaging to Brenda's case, he'd discovered that she'd actually Googled how to claim lottery winnings alone on her phone the morning after their purchase, hours before she talked to Margaret about their agreement. "The phone records are devastating," Tom explained. She knew exactly what she was doing from the very beginning. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness. It was premeditated deception. Margaret nodded, feeling tired but vindicated. The past 3 weeks had been brutal. David had called repeatedly, alternating between anger and pleading, trying to convince her to drop the lawsuit. Brenda had sent letters through her lawyer offering small settlements that were clearly meant to be insulting.
But Margaret had held firm, supported by Tom's growing confidence in their case and by something more valuable, the knowledge that she was fighting for the right reasons. What's our timeline looking like? The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week. Given the strength of our evidence, I expect Brenda's lawyer to push for a settlement before this goes to trial. Bad publicity is the last thing she wants. Margaret thought about the media attention the case had already attracted. Local grandmother sues daughter-in-law over lottery lies had been the headline in yesterday's paper. The story had gone viral on social media, with thousands of comments supporting Margaret's fight for justice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Saw the news story about your case. Just wanted you to know I love you and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Dad and I are staying in a hotel until this gets sorted out. Mom isn't handling the stress very well."
Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. Whatever happened with the lawsuit, she'd already won something important: the respect of her granddaughter and the knowledge that she'd refused to be victimized. Tom's phone rang, and he answered with his usual professional greeting. Margaret watched his expression change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "I see. Yes, we can be there in an hour. Thank you." He hung up and turned to Margaret with a grin that made him look 20 years younger. That was Brenda's lawyer. They want to settle. For how much? 50% of the winnings, plus all legal fees, plus a written agreement that you can remain in your house for as long as you choose. Margaret felt the room spin slightly. $45 million, more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. "What did you tell him?" "I told him we'd consider it, but Margaret, this is a good offer. Better than I expected, honestly. It gives you everything you were fighting for." Margaret stood and walked to Tom's window, looking out at the city where she'd lived her entire life. In the distance, she could see the neighborhood where her house sat, where her memories lived, where she'd planned to spend her remaining years. What happens if we reject the settlement and go to trial? We'd probably win, but there are always risks, and it would take months, maybe years to resolve completely. In the meantime, the money stays frozen. Margaret thought about Brenda, probably sitting in some lawyer's office right now, finally understanding that her lives had consequences. She thought about David, caught between the two women who had shaped his life. She thought about Emma, watching her family tear itself apart over money and deception. "I want to add one more condition to the settlement," Margaret said. "What's that?" "A public apology. I want Brenda to admit publicly that she lied about those lottery numbers, that we had an agreement to split the winnings, and that she tried to defraud me out of my share. I want it in the newspaper, the same newspaper where she told her lies." Tom raised his eyebrows. "That's going to be a tough sell. Her lawyer will fight it hard. It's essentially admitting to fraud in a public forum. Then we go to trial," Margaret said simply. "This was never just about the money, Tom. It was about the truth. If she wants my forgiveness and my silence, she needs to own what she did." An hour later, they sat across from Brenda and her lawyer in a sterile conference room that smelled of fear and expensive colognes. Brenda looked like she'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, her designer clothes couldn't hide the weight she'd lost, and her hands shook slightly as she gripped a coffee cup. Her lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Harrison Webb, wasted no time getting to the point. "My client is prepared to offer Mrs. Chen 45% of the winnings plus legal fees in exchange for dropping all claims." 50%, Tom replied calmly, "plus legal fees, plus guaranteed housing rights, plus a public apology admitting the fraudulent statements." Webb's expression hardened. "The apology is off the table. Everything else is negotiable." Margaret spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Then there's nothing to negotiate." All eyes turned to her. Brenda's were red-rimmed and desperate, her lawyers calculating and cold, but Margaret felt the calm that came from knowing exactly what she was fighting for. "Mrs. Chen," Webb said in the tone lawyers used when they thought they were dealing with someone unsophisticated, "you need to understand the risks of going to trial. Juries are unpredictable. You could end up with nothing." "I already have nothing," Margaret replied. 3 weeks ago, I had a daughter-in-law who lied to my face, a son who was ready to throw me out of my own home, and a family that valued money more than trust. Going to trial can't make that worse." Brenda finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma Chen, please. I made a mistake. Can't we put this behind us?" Margaret studied the woman who had shared her kitchen table just 3 weeks ago, who had grabbed her hands and called her partner, who had plotted to steal from her before the lottery ticket was even scratched.
You didn't make a mistake, Brenda. You made a choice. You chose to lie to the press about numbers that had no meaning to you. You chose to try to steal money that wasn't yours. You chose to try to force me out of my home. And you chose to do all of that while pretending to care about me. I do care about you. Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. No, you don't. You care about what people think of you. You care about maintaining the image of a loving family while you destroy it from the inside. You want me to disappear quietly so you don't have to face the consequences of what you've done. Brenda's composure cracked completely. Fine, you want the truth? I never wanted you in our lives. You're a constant reminder that David had a life before me, that I'll never be the most important woman in his life because you'll always be his mother. I thought the lottery was finally my chance to start fresh, to have the life I wanted without you hovering in the background. The honesty was brutal, but Margaret felt oddly grateful for it. At least now they were dealing with reality instead of pretense. There it is, Margaret said quietly. That's what this was really about. Not the money, not the house. You wanted me erased. And you know what? Brenda continued, her voice rising with years of suppressed resentment. I'm not sorry about it. I'm sorry I got caught, but I'm not sorry for wanting my own life. Webb looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Brenda, please stop talking. But Brenda was beyond caring about legal strategy. You sit in that house like some kind of shrine keeper, making everyone feel guilty for wanting to move forward. David can't make a decision without wondering what his precious mother will think. Emma can't grow up normally because she has to worry about hurting Grandma's feelings. We're all walking on eggshells around you, and I'm tired of it. Margaret absorbed the words like physical blows, each one landing with the force of truth. Because underneath all the cruelty, Brenda wasn't entirely wrong. Margaret had held on tight to her role as the family matriarch, had perhaps been too quick to offer opinions about decisions that weren't really hers to make. But that didn't excuse theft. It didn't justify lies, and it certainly didn't give Brenda the right to destroy a family rather than have an honest conversation about boundaries. You're right about some things. I probably have been too involved in decisions that weren't mine to make. But that gave you the right to steal from me, to lie about me in the newspaper, to try to force me out of my home? Brenda deflated like a punctured balloon. I just wanted it to be over. Well, it is now, Margaret said, standing. Tom, I think we're done here. As they prepared to leave, Webb made one last attempt. Mrs. Chen, my client is willing to go to 60% of the winnings, no apology required. Think about what that money could mean for your future. Margaret paused at the door. Mr. Webb, I'm 72 years old. I don't have enough future left to spend 60% of $90 million. But I have enough pride left to refuse money from someone who stole it from me and then refuse to admit what she did. The trial began 2 months later, on a gray November morning that matched Margaret's mood. The courthouse was packed with reporters and curious onlookers who had followed the story through its many twists and turns. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table wearing her best dress, navy blue with pearl buttons, the same one she'd worn to David's wedding. Tom had prepared her well for what to expect, but sitting in that courtroom, facing a jury of 12 strangers who would decide whether her truth was worth defending, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Brenda's lawyer presented their case first, arguing that verbal agreements between family members were unenforceable and that Margaret was simply a bitter old woman trying to profit from her daughter-in-law's good fortune. He painted Brenda as a generous person who had tried to accommodate an increasingly difficult relative. But Tom's cross-examination was devastating. He forced Webb to explain why Brenda had lied to the press about her mother being dead. He presented the phone records showing Brenda's Google searches about claiming lottery winnings alone. Most damaging of all, he played a recording of Brenda's own deposition where she'd admitted to wanting Margaret out of their lives. Emma testified on the second day, looking uncomfortable but resolute in her school uniform. She answered Tom's questions clearly and honestly, describing the conversation she'd witnessed between Margaret and Brenda about being partners and splitting everything 50-50. On cross-examination, Webb tried to suggest that Emma had misunderstood or misremembered the conversation. Emma's response was quiet but firm. "I know what I heard. They shook hands. Grandma kept her part of the agreement. Mom didn't." David was called a witness by Brenda's team, clearly hoping he would support his wife's version of events. But under oath, forced to choose between honesty and loyalty, he admitted that he'd heard his mother and wife discussing their partnership on several occasions. "Did you believe they had an agreement?" Tom asked. David looked across the courtroom at his mother, then at his wife, and Margaret saw the moment when he realized he couldn't save both of them. "Yes," he said quietly, "I believed they had an agreement." The trial lasted 4 days. Margaret testified on the third day, telling her story simply and honestly, without embellishment or emotional manipulation. She acknowledged that she might have been too involved in her son's family, but she maintained that nothing justified theft and deception. Under cross-examination, Webb tried to paint her as vindictive and greedy, questioning why she needed so much money at her age. Margaret's response became the most quoted line of the trial.
This was never about need, Mr. Webb. It was about truth. If we don't hold people accountable for their lies, especially the people we trust most, then trust becomes meaningless. When the jury returned after 6 hours of deliberation, the foreman stood with the verdict that would reshape 3 lives forever. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Margaret Chen. We award her 50% of the lottery winnings, plus legal fees, plus punitive damages in the amount of $5 million for intentional fraud. The courtroom erupted in applause. Margaret sat perfectly still, feeling not triumph, but a deep, weary relief that the truth had finally been acknowledged. But the legal victory was only the beginning of a longer, more complicated reckoning. 6 months after the trial, Margaret sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where this whole saga had begun, reading a letter from Emma. Her granddaughter was spending the summer in California with Margaret's sister, giving the family time to process the aftermath of their public destruction. "Dear Grandma, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I wanted you to know that I understand why you fought so hard. Mom was wrong to lie and to try to steal from you, but I also understand why she felt trapped. Living with family is hard sometimes, even when you love each other." Margaret smiled at her granddaughter's wisdom. At 16, Emma had learned lessons about family and truth and the price of both that many adults never mastered. The money had been transferred to Margaret's account 3 weeks ago, $45 million plus the punitive damages plus legal fees. More money than she could have imagined having, certainly more than she could spend in her remaining years. She'd used some of it to set up trust funds for Emma's education and for other grandchildren she might never meet. She donated a substantial amount to legal aid societies that helped elderly people fight financial exploitation. The rest sat in investment accounts, growing slowly while she decided what to do with a fortune she'd never wanted. Brenda and David had divorced 2 months after the trial. Brenda had moved to Florida with her portion of the lottery winnings, cutting all ties with the family she'd tried so hard to escape. David had rented a small apartment across town and was slowly trying to rebuild his relationship with both his mother and his daughter. It was awkward, painful work. Too much had been said, too many truths had been revealed for them to simply return to the way things had been. But they were trying, meeting for coffee once a week, taking careful steps towards something that might eventually resemble forgiveness. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Tom Walsh's name appeared on the screen. "Margaret, I have some interesting news. Brenda's lawyer just called." Margaret set down Emma's letter. "What now?" "She wants to appeal the verdict, specifically the punitive damages portion. Her lawyer thinks they can argue that $5 million was excessive." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "What do you think our chances are?" "The appeal? We'd probably win. The jury was well within their rights to award punitive damages for fraud. But Margaret, you should know,
An appeal would mean more legal proceedings, more publicity, more time in courtrooms. Are you prepared for that? Margaret looked around her kitchen, at the home she'd fought so hard to keep, at the life she'd defended against someone who had wanted to erase her. She thought about Brenda, apparently still unwilling to accept the consequences of her choices, still fighting battles she'd already lost.
Tom, she said finally, I'm tired of fighting. If she wants to appeal, let her. But I'm done. Whatever happens, happens. Are you sure? We could countersue for the costs of defending the appeal. No, I got what I was fighting for. Acknowledgement that the truth matters. Everything else is just money. After she hung up, Margaret walked through her house, seeing it not as a battlefield won, but as a home reclaimed. She paused in the living room, where Robert's picture sat on the mantel, his smile frozen in a moment of happiness from their 40th wedding anniversary. Well, she said to the photograph, it's been quite a year. She thought he would have been proud of her for fighting, but also relieved that she was finally ready to stop. Some battles were worth waging, but wisdom meant knowing when victory had been achieved. That evening, Margaret called Emma in California. Grandma, how are you? I'm good, sweetheart. I wanted to tell you something. Your mother is going to appeal part of the court decision. Emma was quiet for a moment. Are you going to fight it? No, I'm done fighting, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. I'm proud of you, Emma said quietly, for fighting when you had to, and for stopping when you didn't. After they hung up, Margaret made herself dinner and ate it at her kitchen table, surrounded by the silence of her own home. Outside, the sun was setting, painting her kitchen walls golden with the last light of day. She thought about the year that had passed, about the family that had been broken and might someday be rebuilt, about the money that had changed nothing essential about who she was or what she valued. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she'd decided to fight back, when she'd chosen truth over peace, dignity over comfort. It had cost her more than she'd expected. Relationships strained, perhaps beyond repair, a granddaughter growing up in the shadow of family scandal, a son caught between loyalty and honesty. But it had also given her something invaluable, the knowledge that she was strong enough to stand up for herself, that her voice mattered, that being old didn't mean being helpless. Margaret cleaned up her dinner dishes and settled into her favorite chair with a book. Tomorrow, she would start planning how to spend the rest of her life. Maybe she would travel, see places she and Robert had always talked about visiting. Maybe she would volunteer more, find ways to use her unexpected fortune to help others. Or maybe she would simply enjoy the profound satisfaction of sitting in her own home and surrounded by her own memories, secure in the knowledge that she had fought for something worth fighting for, and won. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one, illuminating the neighborhood where Margaret Chen had lived for 35 years, where she had raised her son and welcomed her daughter-in-law and watched her granddaughter grow up. This was still her street, still her home, still her life. And that, Margaret thought as she opened her book to the first page, was victory enough.